It's late afternoon in Ukraine, and that's where Joseph Lindsley is. Joe, I know you're a student of history, so you probably are aware that on this day in 1988, the Soviet Union began withdrawing its troops from Afghanistan, 8 years after its forces had entered the country. Something to think about today, huh?
Yeah, there's a lot of things come to mind with that. Of course, our own American long war in Afghanistan, and for the Soviets. I mean, many people think that there's so many fatalities for Moscow during their years in Afghanistan that was one thing that led perhaps to the breakup of the Soviet Union. And then just a couple, 3 years later in 1991, there was so much hope and promise as the Soviet Union dissolved and began to dissolve, and many countries found prosperity, like the Baltic nations. Interestingly, George H.W. Bush came to Kyiv in 1991 and encouraged the people of Ukraine not to seek independence from the Soviet Union, but to stick together. The people of Ukraine rejected that and voted for their independence in 1991. And now here we are again, 2023, with once again a tyrannical Moscow seeking to control. Yesterday here in Lviv, it was a brilliant and sunny day. The car-free streets of the center were crowded with people sitting outside. Lviv has long been a city for festivals, which kept going even in the pandemic. And you don't see anything like that on a grand scale these days. But there was, for example, over the weekend, a coffee, vinyl, and vintage festival. I ran into a soldier friend who was wounded in battle. He was on the way to read a poem he wrote there at this festival. And people going to drink craft coffee. And so there is some sense of life happening. But the war is never far away. And as you walk around the streets of Lviv, you see many young men missing arms and legs. It's becoming more and more of a common sight. And meanwhile, we hear there's good news, cautiously good news. We hear of some Ukrainian gains on the northern and southern flanks around Bakhmut. But also in many ways, it was a disturbing weekend. And Saturday at 4 o'clock in the morning, I woke up for some reason. And then just a few minutes later, there was a massive thud. The buildings and windows of central Lviv shook, rattled and shook. And I expected to hear the air alarm any minute, and there was nothing. And then a few minutes later, there was another shockwave, and boom, but no air alarm. And a few people heard it around the city. Many people slept through it, and everyone was sort of puzzled why it was 40 minutes after that first thud that we heard the air raid alarm. And the sensation that I felt at a little bit after 4 o'clock in the morning on Saturday was akin to sensations I felt and sounds I'd heard when I've been in Kharkiv, when missiles have struck 2 blocks from me. But there was nothing that hit anywhere near Lviv, and that's why the air alarm was, there was no threat to Lviv. And we found out later at the same time, about 4:08 Saturday morning, the Russians attacked the city of Kilminsky, and it was a massive attack. And you can see the video of the multiple explosions, almost like a mushroom cloud over the city. Windows were broken throughout the entire city, and it was something huge. And trying to figure out what I felt here in Lviv, 150 miles away from that city, perhaps it was a shockwave from that attack. It was something absolutely massive. In Russian social media, they've been gloating about this and saying that the Russians have hit Ukrainian munitions depot, perhaps with newly arrived weapons from the West, which would be a really, a major disaster. And in Ukraine, it's been total silence about what happened for the most part, except, the local damage reports in that city. But Ukrainian supporters outside of Ukraine are saying it's also very likely that the Russians, perhaps desperate, are using old Soviet maps because they don't have such, if indeed they don't have such good intel on the ground here in Ukraine. They're using old Soviet maps, and perhaps they hit an old Soviet depot, and perhaps with spent fuel rods. So we don't know. We do know that, you look at the word, whether you can be precise and whether you can be accurate. The Russians certainly were precise. They hit something very directly, but whether or not that was an active, vital target is a big question. And then that night, Saturday night, right as the Ukrainian group Tvorchi was about to go on stage for Eurovision in Liverpool in the UK, the Russians attacked the hometown of that band, of Andre and Jeffrey, 10 minutes before they went on stage. And it was another massive explosion, another critical infrastructure, perhaps. And so this had everyone really on edge. In fact, there was an air alarm not long after that here in Lviv, and there was a sense that something wicked was brewing. And if you look at, especially when you see that right before those two guys, including a guy born in Nigeria who represents Ukraine, an African immigrant to Ukraine, very tolerant, welcoming country, and he actually sang one line in Ukrainian in Liverpool as they sang their song, which is mostly in English. And the fact that the Russians chose to target their city, which is not often hit since Russia's big invasion, the city of Ternopil, chose to target 10 minutes before they went on stage. These, if anyone who starts to forget maybe what kind of evil, maniacal enemy we're up against, that's a good reminder that this is, and then even now as President Zelenskiy is in the UK and he was in Rome over the weekend, but it's hard to, it might be hard to remember now, but there was, in the early days and weeks of this war, President Zelenskyy's life was at risk. The Russians thought they could take Kyiv, and they tried to go after Zelensky many times. And so just because Ukraine's had these successes, I think it might, we have once again some clear reminders of the type of evil that we are going up against.
Frightening. President Zelensky's tour of Ukraine's European allies is in the news. Do you think this is mainly for show, or is there substance that will come out of this?
I think both. I think he's actually trying to, really urgently trying to get support. The Britain, he was just meeting with the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak of the UK. Britain has been very supportive with long-range weapons, some of which have just arrived in Ukraine, which would enable Ukraine to attack Russian positions in occupied Crimea. The United States has been reluctant. In fact, there was a big interview, the Washington Post interviewed Zelensky, and saying that, the White House does not want Zelensky to, Ukraine to attack anything on Russian occupied Russian territory. So this is a big difference between the UK position, it seems, and Washington. And interestingly, in that Washington Post interview, the Post was asking Zelensky about that big document leak that happened last month, and they were pushing Zelensky to confirm or deny. And President Zelensky said, he pushed back at the Post. He said, "What are you trying to do?" He said, "I'm not going to confirm or deny anything because then I'm going to reveal information." He said, this leak, all I can say, it was bad for Ukraine. But if I get into the details of it, it's going to hurt my people. And he got really frustrated with the Post. He said, this is not just a story. This is going to affect life and death. And they kept pushing him. And they said, it's clearly a sensitive issue for you and your country. And President Zelensky says, it's not sensitive. If I tell you it's sensitive, then you're going to make that your headline, And so he really got into kind of a serious argument with the Post. And I guess the last thing I'll say on his travels around Europe now, he also went to Italy, where the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, has been a major, many of the people who support her in the United States are skeptical of Ukraine. But some of her coalition partners in Italy are skeptical of Ukraine. But she's been a strong ally. And so I think by meeting with Rishi Sunak, by meeting with Meloni in Italy, as we gear up for what I think will become more and more difficult times, Zelensky is finding his strongest allies to face the fight ahead.
Joseph Lindsley in Ukraine. Joseph, we'll talk tomorrow. I hope you don't have any more of those Saturday 4 a.m. experiences.
Yeah. Until tomorrow. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you for introducing Ukraine on your social media pages. That's very important that much more people can get more information about the situation here and how everybody can help Ukraine to stay stronger and to save all the world.
Что он сказал?
Well, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?
Come on now. Oh, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?